What's up, guys? My name is Noah Weatherly, and today we're going to be talking about Home Fire by Camila Shamsi, and more specifically, one of the five pivotal protagonists of the novel, Mr. Parvaiz Pasha. And now, Parvaiz Pasha, as you can tell by the title of the presentation, I deem as a tragic character, and arguably a tragic hero, though I make an argument for him being a tragic villain later in the presentation. But you might hear the word tragedy and have a knee jerk reaction, given that, we are literary people. We've gotten this far in the English curriculum that we should know what tragedy implies in a character, especially a tragic hero, but I think he fits the bill on paper. A tragic hero is described as a great or virtuous character who is destined for downfall, suffering, calamity, what have you. And though he may not be great, would I would dote to call him virtuous, as in, well, maybe not necessarily virtuous, but undeserving of the fate dealt to him given his moralistic alignment. And that's just due to his nature, his gentleness, his aspirations for the future, his goals, his desire to be a part of British society and a part of whatever they have to offer. But he's met with this adverse xenophobia that the British government and public offer him, and due to such, he makes decisions that lead him to being aligned with the jihadists, and a tragic fate befalls him, one that I feel he was undeserving of. And thus, let me not get ahead of myself. Let's just go ahead and get into the slide. So if we want to move on to slide 2 with me, Parvaiz Pasha, a born terrorist or a product of chance? Now, this is a pretty rhetorical question. No one's born a terrorist, despite what Fox News would have you believe. So, chance or luck is a theme we have been exploring recently in The Old Drift, which indicates that chance is just as formative to identity as individual action. I believe this to be true. Chance is critical to the formation of Parvaiz's character. Circumstances out of his control rule his life, such as the vehement vigor of his father's radical ideas, the hostility of the British public towards Muslims, which can be deemed as outright xenophobia, and the enrapturing influence of the spirited Farouk. Due to these environmental factors, Parvaiz is set on a path of self destruction, one that certainly isn't one of his own making. Tragedy, but it, sorry, one that certainly isn't of his own making. So, chance we've been discussing in globalization novels as one of the cornerstones of identity, and well, just identity as a human, among personal choice and environmental factors. And I think the chance, as I've just detailed, certainly had more than a pivotal role to play in the formation of Parvaiz's character. His interactions with the British public, his dependence on the archaic ideals of his father, and his severe lack of role models in his life lead him down this path to being aligned with jihadist and, radical ideals, and this radical terrorism that he finds himself engrossed in, though it's very difficult to describe him as a terrorist. So, but another aspect that we're going to discuss about Home Fire is the allegorical modern reimagining of Sophocles' Antigone, a tragic play that details the plight of Polynices and his sisters Antigone and Ismene, which, my apologies if I'm butchering pronunciations, but I haven't seen any videos. I've only read a bunch of scholarly articles about it. But by basing her novel on a tragic play, it's clear what Shamsi's intentions and temperament are toward her characters, and that is that she wants readers, as well as just the general commonwealth, to be less prone to judgment, such concrete, sweeping, condemning judgment based on what they view on television. She wants to instill readers with a healthier dose of skepticism. And on top of that, she wants to make sure that her readers are not as prone to giving in to stereotypes and generalizing individuals based on just specific instances that they viewed. But we're going to discuss on the next slide Parvaiz versus Polynices first. And it's not necessarily versus Polynices, that was just a clever title for the slide. When you know, they're symbolic of one another, or Parvaiz is symbolic of Polynices, reminiscent of Polynices. Polynices was a victim of war, one of the two sons of King Creon. As a result of Polynices dying while waging war against his father, Creon decides that he will leave Polynices' body to rot on the battlefield. It sounds pretty familiar, right? This is clearly indicative of the plight of Parvai, given that he dies somewhere unfamiliar and the country closest to home for him reproaches the idea of him being buried there. So, was Parvai deserving of such a punishment? The obvious answer is no, which depicts him as a tragic character even further. See, short answer, no. I'll discuss this on a later slide, but Polynices' revolution against Creon does not endow Creon with the ability to play judge and jury. And given that Britain is representative of Creon in this story, literally embodies Creon, it's to be assumed that Shamsi, as well as like minded readers and critics, believe that Britain is at fault and to blame and is not more enlightened and more endowed and more inclined to, or has a higher state of thinking. Those who serve on the government in Britain or serve on the parliament are just as human as Parvais, and yet he's being condemned to this fate, being condemned to have his family never truly experience any form of closure, if closure exists, with the prospect of his death. But like the, Creon, like Britain, is outrageous and somewhat petulant in the treatment of their son. A father refusing to claim his son sounds pretty familiar, considering that Parvais is a British citizen, though he is never considered such by actual denizens of England. So, how does this apply to the tragic villain trope? Or we're moving on to the next slide, how the tragic villain trope applies, where we see the Joker, pretty common DC character, you probably know him. And the Joker, he doesn't have remorse in his actions, but he was a product of his environment, just as Parvais was, though their sins are not near comparable. The Joker's a mass murderer, and Parvais is not. So, but just talking about their formation, the Joker was not a heinous, evil individual upon his birth, as people would have you believe about terrorists and terrorism whenever you see it on TV. Parvais was not a bad person, but he was still dangerous to an extent. This danger that he posed wasn't created by him, and it wasn't a product of his nature or his hatred for things nationalistic. He was a product of his environment, molded from his father's radical ideology and shaped by terrorists who seemed to reflect his own justified vigor. He only aligned himself with terrorists who seemed to pose a threat to Western civilization due to his need and want to see visceral change in the world, to see a change, a peaceful and hopeful change to how his people are viewed and treated and discriminated against. But Britain carries just as much blame for his defection as jihadists. Would Parvais have felt the need to rebel in such an egregious fashion if he didn't feel unwelcome in his own country? I mean, that's a difficult question to answer, but the answer is most likely no. He wouldn't have felt the need to rebel had he not felt like a stranger in a place that he called home initially. So, that leads us into the actual occurrence versus media perception on the next slide, which I have this sweet Facebook Karen meme to represent how social media influences people, which honestly it's not too far off the mark. Because what actually occurred, Parvais was influenced by his father, urged towards radical nationalism from a formative age when his mind was most malleable. Upon encountering nothing but hostility and racism in Britain, Parvais seizes his first opportunity to be a part of something that somewhat reflects his hopeful ideals. But what did the media perceive in the face of his actual actions? A story without nuance. Every terrorist in the eyes of mass media is without face, origin, or soul, reduced to a generalistic term that carries with it the same condemning otherness that is practiced by citizens that Isma and Parvais encounter in droves, and that is where the xenophobia also comes to play once more. But how does it all relate? On the next slide, which this is another, slide 3 is also an image from Antigone, but this is another image from Antigone of, let's see, I have it here, sorry to consult my notes here, but the character that's meant to represent Anika is reaching out towards her sister, because ultimately Ismene in the, or Anika in the actual play, the actual original tragedy, she is entombed alive, and that is her punishment for aligning herself with Polynices or Parvais. And just as Antigone vehemently pleads with Creon that Polynices does not. Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Parvais relates to Polynices through their treatment after death. For his beliefs, which are perceived as concrete and unchanging by the British public, Parvais is dehumanized and deemed unworthy of a burial plot in Britain. Just as Antigone vehemently pleads with Creon that Polynices does not deserve to be left for the flies due only to his differing ideology, the difference in political alignment of Parvais should not strip him of the most basic of human rituals. He did not become a monster, a connotation that accompanies the damning word terrorist, and also it plays back into the trope of the tragic villain, or more aptly in this case, the tragic monster, such as Frankenstein. Frankenstein was created and then abhorred by his creator and detested by the reality that he had never asked to be a part of. And thus he became the monster. He became what everyone believes him to be. And such is the case in a less hyperbolic faction with Parvais. So, in summary, Parvais was a good guy. Was a good guy. Not to simplify systemic racism, but Parvais was a good apple amongst a crowd of overzealous orange enthusiasts, or maybe more aptly, apple detesters. His difference from other British denizens was not a negative one, but the outward xenophobic hostility portrayed him as an enemy of peace, stirred by fear of otherness, not unlike America's treatment of the Red Scare. Polynices wasn't rendered inhuman for opposing the will of another individual who is also human. Creon was playing God by insisting that Polynices not be buried, just as Britain is doing in their horrible treatment of Parvais' death. So, ultimately, what is the takeaway here? What is the takeaway here? It's that Parvais, as the slide indicates, was not a bad guy. He was a good guy. He was a decent human being who was driven to the place that he ultimately ended up in by societal factors, by outward factors, by the factors guaranteed by chance. In any other situation, Parvais would have been a gifted sound designer. He would have been working on, who knows, like Shameless or something like that. And it truly services the narrative that he was a tragic character, that he had these moralistically good goals and these harmless goals for himself and those aligned with him. So the ending message, I suppose, I don't really know how to end this, is that Parvais was a victim. He was victimized by his government, by society, and by those who prey on the unguided, weak minded, or the weak resolve of those who are engrossed in a situation that they don't desire, such as the jihad is preying on those who are victims of racism and xenophobia and thus feel that they need to align themselves with someone who doesn't detest their existence. So, RIP Parvais. And I hope that you guys enjoyed this. I hope it was informative, and it's been a great class. I loved every second of it. See you guys around.